It was the night of the arrest of one of my students this semester in an independent study on Chicano studies and decolonial spirituality. But on this night, he was writing me because he had participated in a totally peaceful sit-in at an administration building at Princeton University. He had an arrest. And that night, he sent me a photo of a handwritten, actually painted note he sent to me, painted in his mother tongue Spanish, and I translate, quote, "Activism is my spirituality. I read books about liberation, but there is blood between the words. They say I have to write and to read. How can I? There is blood in my books, tears in my mouth. Profe, permit me to struggle, to shout, to march and cry in the place of our papers. Let me counter justice and liberation between the sea and the river, because there is none between the words." I treasure the note, and I had already waived the final paper for him, actually, in that independent study, as I did for members in one of my classes. My argument for doing this was that the pursuit of truth requires, in practice, holding open all of our critical communities to ideally all potential interlocutors. And at present, the practice of scholasticide, as part of the genocide we're seeing underway against Palestinian teachers, artists, and other colleagues in education throughout Gaza, makes travesty of our intellectual endeavors. At an institution like Princeton Seminary, which had officially pursued a policy of neutrality, hence complicity, it's a mockery to critical scholarship to maintain the rituals of a grading hierarchy, while the US-backed Israel state is in full swing, raining down death and genocide on the people of Gaza and Palestine. I found other ways to end my courses in meaningful conversation with my students. It has been hard for me to maintain hope, and I'm looking for hope that is real, that is concrete and down to earth. It's difficult, though, in the onslaught of slow violence and the genocide of coloniality and imperiality that we're seeing now. The 8 months of slaughter present a killing machine at work that we've seen before in the history of Western colonialism and imperialism, but that does not take away from the horror and added rage of the Gaza Strip. I want to acknowledge, as I begin my paper and think about it, a few of my colleagues who have stepped forward to form a Faculty for Justice in Palestine chapter. This is a national movement of 5 of us faculty with 3 administrators. It just formed last week, really. After 30 to 40 of our students had worked with Jewish Voices for Peace and others really since October in the movement and encampments and other actions for justice in Palestine, basically to stop the slaughter that's underway by the US-backed regime in Israel. I have a certain sense of working in an abyss here, amidst mystery, as I face the infuriating rage and lament over what we are witnessing with so much silence around me and around so many of us. There was a line from Darwish's book, In the Presence of Absence, that I found meaningful, maybe you too. Quote, "Anger has scorched my tears. I can no longer look at the present because zeal has lifted me to its highest paths and tomorrow's sun has illuminated my tunnels." Now, the interpretation of Darwish is always difficult for me, and it's a poetry that comes out of another people, not my own, but I can connect on a very deep humanity in a way. What does it mean to be illuminated in our tunnels? Anger scorching our tears is a bit clearer. Along the way of presenting this paper, I found myself asking, why am I reading Darwish? Who would I read in the American scene where I am working? I turned to June Jordan and her great work on Moving Toward Home, where she writes about being black and Palestinian. But of course, I'm not black. So on to John Berger, his poetic prose in Hold Everything Dear as a white person identifying with struggle on the underside of Western imperial power was very meaningful. And he wrote with a sense of groaning over the entire situation. And then too, I labor with this word after. Darwish had written, what will come after the ashes? And theology after Gaza, is it not a kind of puzzling phrase? What does it mean to say after when thinking of Gaza now? I read Ghassan Kanafani's 1956 letter from Gaza. 1956. In a sense, we've been after Gaza at least since then. When have we not been after Gaza? Long time, it seems to me, if we reflect on it. I count myself guilty of not thinking after Gaza soon enough and strongly enough, and I suspect it's part of the wisdom of our conveners here to recall that after does not mean we're positioned on some temporal line and we'll make some progress and get into some aftermath. No, this is going to be with us for the long haul, and it's going to be a comprehensive geopolitical struggle that we need to address. I am writing in this essay primarily, I suspect, for my students and for those in the U.S. settings who want to know why this issue is important, why there has erupted the pro-Palestinian movements that we are seeing. And I think I need help now of actually putting the PowerPoint up on the screen. I think I'm supposed to, it's different than usual here. I tap something, right? There it is, okay. Thank you. The countervailing political spirituality after Gaza. There are three parts to the paper that I want to set before you, just to get the basic structure of this out in front of you. I will even be selective with these slides. But part one of the essay is on Britain's imperial history and Israel's emergence. My supposition that before talking about a counter-imperial theology or spirituality, and before talking about a political spirituality that might be countervailing to the imperium, my colleagues and interlocutors in the United States need to know that there's such a problem as imperialism and what that consists of. And so in the first part, I briefly try to engage the issue of Britain's imperial history and Israel's emergence. And I'm going here for presenting an understanding of the Israeli state in Palestine as I articulate as a uniquely generative historical formation of British imperial presence, using history to show how important Palestine was to the British Empire, which had a lot to do with the intensification of the problematics we see arising with the Israeli state. Part two, then, is Israel within today's global imperial regime. Here, I'm looking for an understanding of the Israeli state as a uniquely generative nodal point of today's US-led transnational empire, the ways in which there are many crossings and connections through US policy in backing Israel in Palestine that connects to transnational geopolitical work. And by the way, here, Achille Mbembe's work is also important to me. The Necropolitics article that he wrote in 2003, as well as the later book by that title, and the very recent Brutalism. In all of these texts, he addresses Palestine and Gaza issues. I'll say a word on that in a minute, but it's important. Sometimes his work has been, I think, treated without noticing how direct his call is in those works to think about Palestine and Gaza. Part three, then, is an experimental section where I propose a memorial practice for and by Gaza's dead, a countervailing political spirituality, experimenting with memorial practices that wield remembrance of the dead as a means for resistance to an erosion of the empire of Pax Americana Israelica. Let me go next to Mbembe and read just this one quote from him to give you an idea of what's going on with his work. In many regions of the globe, systematic surveillance is already the rule. Time is being ceaselessly pulverized, and a vast swath of humanity is reduced to leading its existence surrounded by barbed wire as if in cages. Caged humanity. Palestine in general and Gaza in particular have become its emblems par excellence. Palestine and Gaza are the great laboratories of the regime of brutalization that is in the process of technological completion and is seeking to globalize itself. The aim is to generalize and extend the extent of empire through Palestine, Gaza, on a global scale, the methods that have been refined during the management of the occupied territories in other wars of predation. That's from his new book, Brutalism. I won't read more by him, but let me come to part one of my paper, where I seek to establish just how important Britain's mandate presence was in this area. I'm not saying things new to you, but I find it a point that needs to be stressed continually. I'm going to go straight to the work of Carolyn Elkins, a Harvard historian, on the legacy of violence in her great book subtitled The History of the British Empire, and read just this one quote. In the 1930s, the mandate was the empire's chief training ground, not only for the rank and file, but also for those destined to lead. Between 1926 and 1947, from the early year of its mandate to its announcement of withdrawal from Palestine in 47, around 10,000 men passed through either the police training depot at Jenin or the potential officers training unit outside Ramallah. Over these decades, Palestine's police force developed a culture all its own. The early years of Irish influence mattered greatly, but so did the acculturating effects of British rule in Palestine. It had developed its own ethos, training methods, and traditions. Indeed, just as events in Palestine were crucial to the convergence and consolidation of colonial-era legalized lawlessness during the Arab Revolt, so were they also pivotal in the evolution of paramilitary mindsets, tactics, and equipment that undulated through the empire with the circulation of thousands of men trained and combat-tested in Palestine. She goes on to point out the many ways in which leaders, soldiers, and technicians and autocrats circulated through Palestine and then out to other places in the empire, in Asia and in Africa. So much more could be talked about here. Let me go right to my part two, the Israeli state in today's global regime. The argument of part two, let me just lay it out without being able to warrant all the steps in it right now. Just as historically the Israeli state emerged from a Palestine that for British Empire was a site of concentration, maturation, and convergence of its liberal imperialism and legalized lawlessness, I argue that similarly today, the Israeli state has become a nodal point, a hub of intersecting powers that is necessary to US-led transnational empire and its liberal imperialism and legalized lawlessness. This requires going into Bembe's notion of vertical sovereignty that is practiced today in Palestine, Israel, kind of a rule for above that is complexified as in few other places. But his point is that that then is the basis for Israel's horizontal sovereignty of extending its influence into other portions of the world. I think I mentioned I came into this movement by studying Israel at work in Guatemala. So much of my paper is on how the US and Israel partner in various ways in global projects of domination and surveillance throughout the world. I look at the way Israel develops security and surveillance technology and military bombing materials that are used all over the world. A militarized Israel, I told this at an encampment in Princeton, a militarized Israel is essential to the United States' larger geopolitical policy because of its connection to a whole web of what Jeffrey Halper, an Israeli anthropologist, says is a global pacification process in which the US and Israel are partners. Halper says this, if I might quote him, "In terms of the breadth of its military relations across the globe and the depths of its involvement in countries' internal security operations, Israel has an unparalleled degree of securocratic reach throughout the world system." That in his book, War Against the People, which I would strongly recommend. I have a note here from former CEO of Magal Security Solutions, based in Israel, Sar Kursh, who claimed that, and he says this positively, Gaza has become a showroom for the company's smart fences as customers appreciate that the products are battle tested. That's that global reach again. So the part 3 of this, and I'll finish this if I can, and I'll just name these without, again, developing them as I do in my paper, is a memorial practice for and by Gaza's dead, a countervailing political spirituality, ? What I do here is I reach for the crucified figure of Jesus in Roman imperial times as a plausible starting point. Plausible not just because I've written on that before, but plausible because many people throughout the global south that I know, as well as in the United States, on the underside of empire, start with the notion of the crucified figure of Jesus and that of crucified peoples, as Ignacio Ellacuría writes of that notion. But also I reach for the crucified figure because it was part of a memorial practice for the dead in Gaza I experienced on my own campus as students, and many of us reached for ways to memorialize and give memorializing shape to our practice. This was a practice that came to visibility in the remembrance of the very names of the dead that were available off of lists that were published online. In our commemorations, we were invited to write the names of the dead in Gaza on sheets of paper, the ages of the people, and plaster them to the interior windows of the chapel of the school, which we did. And so I'm suggesting that we develop more fully the notion of a memorial practice of remembering the dead. In this way, we display the presence of the dead. If there's one thing settler colonialism and imperialism wants, it's elimination of the dead and of their names. We need to display the presence of the dead by name and in face. That's the first aspect of the memorial practice I suggest. Moving on so quickly, this means recovering the stories of the dead. They have been robbed by imperial and settler power of their stories. And I've learned from many of you that you're working on and have been recovering the stories of the dead. The people in the metropole society and nations need to know those stories. There needs to be a public performance of mourning for the dead, worked out in the streets, I think, and in our communities. This is something that is often attacked by authorities, as Shireen Abu Akleh's funeral was attacked in East Jerusalem. It will take valor to do and undertake this mourning. And then fourth and finally, I suggest that we need to do this with meticulous care so that we record and register the kinds of violations that have been done so that there can be reparation and restitution, and actually feed specifics of the violation so that we create conditions for prosecuting and effecting restitution.